Hey, what's going on, guys? Heads here from Infinity Loops, and welcome back. Today we take a look at a new bind and fly from NewBeeDrone. This is the upgraded Acrobee75 BLV5. What we have here is a 2S 75mm bind and fly. It will cost $159.99 on the day of release, which I believe should be today. What we're going to do today is just run through the parts real quick, some of the upgrades and new features we see on this bind and fly. Then we'll hop into some flight footage as usual. We will finish off with some final thoughts. Let's go ahead and start with the flight controller, considering that's the newest piece of hardware on this build. That is the NewBeeDrone BeeBrain BLV5 flight controller. Some differences from the previous flight controller would be, number one, this is running the STM32G4 MCU. It's also running the MPU 6000 gyro, so those are different from the BLV4, I believe. It also comes equipped with 20 amp ESCs per channel, as well as ELRS 3. Also featured on this flight controller is an internal VTX that can go from 25 milliwatts to 100 milliwatts to 400 Smart Max, which the 400 Smart Max is a feature of the flight controller where you can run it at 400 milliwatts, and as the flight controller heats up, or if you're flying on a very hot day, when the flight controller gets too warm, it will lower the milliwatt output of the VTX to reduce the heat on the build. As it cools, it will slowly ramp the milliwatts back up. So it kind of handles all that for you. Just set it to 400 Smart Max and let her rip. Now, dangling off of that flight controller, we also have this T antenna in the back here that is fit between the little nubbins on the back of the cockroach frame. Speaking of, this is a 75mm cockroach frame, or cockroach 75, with the carbon fiber brace on the bottom, if you're familiar with those. Another thing dangling off of that flight controller would be the XT30 for your battery. Moving away from the flight controller, we can have a look at these big old coffee can motors we got on here. These are the NewBeeDrone Flow 804 14,000 kV dual ball bearing motors, and these are running tri-blade 40mm Aussie props on top. Moving up to the front here, we have the Runcam Nano 4, which I have personally very little experience with. I know it's been out for a bit, but I don't really see it used that often, so I'm interested to dive into that and see how that looks. That Nano 4 is housed inside of this Goober V2 canopy that has adjustable camera angle. Another thing I saw mentioned on the ad for this whoop is that it is professionally tuned PIDs right out of the box. So I'm excited to see what professionally tuned PIDs fly like. And finally, the batteries we will be using on this build are the Tattoo 2S 650 milliamp and 450 milliamp that NewBeeDrone was kind enough to send over with the drone. That should do it for the build. We don't really need to talk about it much more. Let's just bind her up, go see how she flies. We'll come back in, we'll talk about it, and give you my feedback. Now right out of the box, this comes with a 25-degree arming angle. You just need to jump in Betaflight and make sure that you change that to a 180-degree arming angle. That way, when you're on your lid, you can engage turtle mode and flip yourself over. On average, I was getting around 5 minutes of flight time with the 450 milliamp batteries and around 6 minutes to 6.5 minutes with those 650 milliamp Tattoo batteries, both of which performed very well. It was actually kind of hard to tell when you had the extra weight of the 650 on there, depending on what kind of flying you were doing. If I was in here doing some more of that proximity stuff, that would show that weight a little more. I could get the tune to wobble some. But other than that, when it's outside, it felt pretty nice between both batteries. One thing I did have issue with when I first got it was the Runcam Nano 4 wasn't playing very nice with my Sky Zone goggles, the 04X. So I switched over to the HD Zeros with a TBS Fusion module on it, and that seemed to fix the image issue. At first I thought it was maybe the Runcam Nano 4 that was the issue, but it was just my goggles. As far as being professionally PID tuned, I think this is pretty good of a tune. I would say most bind and fly tunes are right around this level, right around where this is at, where it's a really good tune depending on what you're doing. And if you get really into the extreme stuff, you can start to see some of those weak points in the tune where it just needs to be tightened up a little bit. I didn't mess with it at all. The only thing I did with this was just changed my rates to Betaflight, the default Betaflight rates. No expo in the expo field, and 667 on all access. So if you were curious, that's really the only change I made. Everything else was just the way it was out of the box. The BLV5 in here, as far as the flight controller is concerned, performed great. As far as the OSD is concerned, that is pretty typical of the older NewBeeDrone flight controllers as well. If you've ever had one, you'll know what I'm talking about, where sometimes you can get the OSD to kind of flicker on you depending on what you're doing. Usually when you're low battery, that can happen. But it seemed like as long as I kept my voltage at a decent level, I was okay with the OSD staying on screen, didn't have any flickering issues. Wasn't really until I got down low or I was doing something a little taxing on the whoop with not much battery life left, like punching up into a power loop or trying to hold a trippy spin while my battery's almost dead, then I would see the OSD flicker a little bit. But if you are used to the normal NewBeeDrone system of the version of Betaflight that they run, the forked version, and their OSD, outside of that, the 0804 motors actually performed really well. I was not expecting to like them very much, to be honest, but I think this is exactly what they wanted them used for because this just worked perfectly. Flying this feels very similar to flying my normal 1S 75mm build. Because these motors are 0804s, even though they're on 2S, they are still kind of soft. They're not as punchy as you would expect a 2S build to be, which I didn't hate. I actually kind of enjoyed that, and I do think that is partly the reason why we are able to get such long flight times out of this build. And the only other gripe really I would say that I have with this is that I just don't know who it's for exactly. I mean, obviously it's for somebody that wants to fly a 75mm with 2S, but I don't know how many pilots are left that still like flying that combination. This was a very popular combination a few years ago, but I think most of those pilots have moved on to smaller and lighter builds. And one last thing I wanted to mention about NewBeeDrone that I think is pretty cool is if you are in the US and you plan on buying one of these, well, number one, it ships in the US, so you don't have to wait for that super long shipping time. They also offer local support and customer service, as well as if you are a US customer, depending on the damage, they do also offer repair and replacement services. So if you are still one of those pilots in the market for a 2S 75mm whoop, you may want to give a glance at the Acrobee75 by NewBeeDrone. I'll leave links down below where you can find one of these if you were looking for one for yourself. Just a heads up, that is an affiliate link. I want to thank NewBeeDrone, firstly, for sending this out and also sending the Tattoo battery so we could fly it. Secondly, I want to thank you for watching this video, and please leave any questions, comments, or, I don't know, worries, concerns. What do you think about this 2S 75mm build? I feel like they've been off the market for a little while, and to see one back on the market leaves me confused, but excited. So let me know how you feel down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, guys. We will see you in the next one. Take care.